What a pleasure and a privilege it is, firstly, to be in Barcelona. I have not been here since 1969, so a lot has changed. But it's a privilege too, because I'm really stunned and excited from what I'm learning about Ship2B and the whole ecosystem, the network of other people who are involved, and directly or indirectly. And part of what I'm hoping is that this visit to Barcelona is just the beginning of a wider conversation and discussion. So let me just take you through the slides, and then hopefully we can get into a question and answer session. So change is happening, but as you all know, change is happening in good ways and not so good ways, and some really quite bad ways at the same time. So I'm not a complete romantic. I don't think change is automatically good. And I've grown up in an era, many of you have too, where as a species we started to see our planet as a whole. And one of the members of our advisory board, Jerry Linenger, was both a cosmonaut and an astronaut. And he spent 5 months on the Mir space station in the 1980s. And he looked down on Earth. And like a lot of the people who went up into space, he came back completely changed. He'd seen the fires burning in Amazonia. He'd seen the coal plumes of soot around Russian or Soviet power stations. And he came back absolutely believing that water was going to be one of the defining issues of the 21st century. I sometimes wish that we could push all of our business leaders, all of our politicians up into space, at least for a few hours, and I think they too might come back transformed. But I'm going to say a few words of introduction. I'm going to talk about the traditional business metrics of risk and return, and then a little bit about impact. I'm going to talk about sustainability and the way in which this agenda is in the process of going exponential, again for good and bad. I'm going to talk about capitalism and its future, and I'm going to talk about carbon productivity. And I'm going to go through that quite quickly. If you want the slides afterwards, you're very welcome to have them. But what an extraordinary period, because if you go back to the 60s and 70s, then you needed an organization the size of NASA to get us up into space. Now you've got people like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, private individuals this is SpaceX, thinking about how you build a new type of space station. But at the same time, here we are alongside the Mediterranean, and we know how much of an issue now plastic waste in the seas is. So at one level, we're doing extraordinary, successful things getting up into space. At the same time, we're completely screwing up the global ocean. So we're a really complicated species, and that's why I say change is happening, but it's not all good. So a few words of introduction. Many of you will recognize Gro Harlem Brundtland. 30 years ago, she produced the so-called Brundtland report, introducing sustainable development into the global political agenda. At that same year, we set up a company called Sustainability. That's the original team. And so 30 years on, we've just had the celebration of that event. And it's extraordinary to see how much has happened over those 30 years, but it's equally quite worrying to see how much we then knew that we have not yet delivered against. Jose very kindly mentioned the triple bottom line. That thinking went into the Global Reporting Initiative, the Dow Jones Sustainability Indexes, and so on. All fantastic, and now into the B Corporation movement, which we're very actively part of. But remember what happened when the Volkswagen story broke. They had just been elected several weeks previously to be the sector leader within the Dow Jones Sustainability Indexes. So there is this question, do we really know what we're trying to measure and push companies and business towards? I think we increasingly do, but we should not be overly confident. And much of my work over the last 40 years has involved, as you've heard, working with business. This photograph I took a number of years ago in Palo Alto, and it was HP, Hewlett-Packard's, their laboratory. And this was a painting. It was a painting of the two founders of HP, Dave Packard and Bill Hewlett, looking into the garage where they founded the company and seeing something else in there. And I love this image because it's just such an extraordinary symbol, in a way, of what the business leadership world has had to increasingly embrace and learn how to deal with. And at the beginning of this century, that sounds strange, but at the beginning of this century, I did a book called The Chrysalis Economy. And the notion was that we were headed into a period of our collective history where we would get into a position of meltdown. Many of you know that in a caterpillar, when a caterpillar goes into a chrysalis, you get a period where everything melts. The organs of the caterpillar come apart. And then there are these things called imaginal cells that are living blueprints, and they start to construct the butterfly. And that's where I think we are now. I think an old order is starting to come apart, and you all are part of that sort of constellation of imaginal cells putting the new order together. I won't read this out, but this was the US Army Corps of Engineers during the Pacific Campaign in the Second World War. I think this is the spirit which we all have to come at these issues increasingly with. Much of what we have to do now in the next 20 or 30 years looks clinically impossible, but it's going to have to be made possible, and I think we can increasingly do that. And you will have watched Bertrand Piccard and his colleagues fly this plane, the Solar Impulse, around the world. And I think, for me, this is a symbol of an emerging technological and economic order in the same way that Charles Lindbergh's Spirit of St. Louis was in the 1920s. That symbolized gasoline as a fuel for the global economy. Solar Impulse symbolizes renewable energy increasingly as the fuel. And the question is often asked, where are we in all of this? The World Economic Forum talks about the fourth industrial revolution. You all know that. But if you stand back a bit and look at those same sort of long wave cycles, it's clear that there have been 5 to date. And the whole sustainable development movement and industry has grown up in the 5th wave. Where are we? We're about here. And this is the period where things become really confused and really uncertain. And so Trump and Brexit and populism and these sorts of things are no accident. It's the beginning of a process of meltdown, economic, social, political. We will come out of that. We will come into the 6th wave, and already people are building towards that. But the question is, how long is that going to take? And my guess is about 12 to 15 years. This is not going to be something that's over next Tuesday or next year. This is a very protracted period of systemic change that we're now involved in. And I love science fiction. I love the work of William Gibson. Many of you will know his phrase, the future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed. And I think part of what I like is traveling around the world and meeting the extraordinary people who are now starting to drive systemic change. And one of the groups that we work with, Atlas of the Future, is partly based here in Barcelona. I think Lisa Goldapple may be here during the day from Atlas of the Future. And one of the things that we've been doing with them is filming, well, put me aside, but some extraordinary innovators, entrepreneurs, impact investors, policymakers around the world. And that's going up on a site co-hosted with the UN Global Compact. So they have 9,000, almost 10,000 company members. And that site is called projectbreakthrough.io. A little bit about impact. I started my career in Egypt. We were talking just a moment ago about desertification. And I was working here, Lake Manzala, and doing environmental impact studies for the United Nations Development Programme in its first year. And I look back at that period and I learned a huge amount from doing that, one of which is that corruption really gets in the way of just anything good that you want to do. But I also realized that I didn't want to work with government. Increasingly, I wanted to work with business. The sort of businesses that I've worked with over the years, some of them have been good again, some of them have been bad. Occasionally, they've been a little bit ugly. But this company, Novo Nordisk, is one of the ones I put as a real leader. There are reasons for that. They're protected by a foundation. They're in a very unusual position. But you may remember that in 2015, Harvard Business Review did their latest ranking of business leaders around the world. And Lars Rabin Sørensen, who was then the CEO of Novo Nordisk, came right at the top. And Jeff Bezos of Amazon, who had previously been in that top position, went down to number 87. Why? Because Harvard Business Review changed the metrics, and 20% of the ranking was now linked to social impact, corporate social responsibility, these sorts of things. So an astonishing shift. But it's interesting when you look at Novo Nordisk, they are being systemic in what they're doing. So for example, they sell insulin. So the wave of diabetes around the world is a complete gold mine for a company like theirs. But they're saying, if the wave of diabetes continues to build, it's going to collapse public healthcare systems in different parts of the world. Therefore, we've got to prevent it. How do we do that? And they're working with cities increasingly to do that. And this is the way that we increasingly think about impact. So the horizontal axis is, it takes you from, it's about impact. It goes from negative impact to positive impact. It's got a slightly peculiar scale to it. So for example, that's 1 billion people killed or damaged. This is 1 billion people benefited. Now that may seem just completely out of this world, but two brothers who I've met both of them show or symbolize the different ends of the spectrum. One of the brothers is Carl Page, and he's involved in the Anthropocene Institute, and they're looking at things like a meteorite strike or a nuclear exchange or a pandemic that could damage 1 billion people or even hundreds of millions of people. His brother, Carl Page, many of you know as one of the co-founders of Google, is thinking about technologies, business models that could benefit up to 1 billion people, perhaps even more. So that's the impact spectrum that I think increasingly we've got to think across. And then the vertical axis is really peculiar. This is the one that goes from incremental change to exponential change. So that's by the time you get to midway, that's a 1x, a one-fold shift. Then it goes 10x and 100x, and things get really peculiar up in this space, as you all know. And exponential trends can take us to breakdown just as easily as they can take us to break through. So that's the way we increasingly think about all of this. So let me say a few words about exponential sustainability. You've all seen these sorts of diagrams. This is the Great Acceleration Project, and it shows a range of different good things, paper production and so on, energy use, but all sorts of associated and linked social and environmental consequences, and all of them on an exponential scale. They're all behaving exponentially, but very often we find them very hard to see. And a lot of people in business are looking at the Sustainable Development Goals, which also came out in 2015, and they're thinking, these are about incremental change. You know, if we do a little bit more of what we're already doing, and we do it a little bit better and a little bit faster, then we'll be happy, and the world will be saved. And it's absolutely not true. The Sustainable Development Goals, if you read them in the right way, are exponential goals. Even if you take the first two goals, no poverty and zero hunger by 2030, and you stretch that out to 2040 or 2050, those are still exponential goals. And most of us are not yet thinking about that and that sort of way. You've all seen this diagram from Singularity University and elsewhere. The sense is that we're somewhere around here on more and more technologies, and that's exciting. And many of you will have read Ismail Salim's book, Exponential Organizations. If you haven't, it's an extremely highly recommended, very clear account of where we are. This was The Economist magazine's cover a couple of months back. It was basically saying that the automotive industry and the oil industry are going to be, in their word, roadkill. They were saying the internal combustion engine is coming to the end of its useful life. And in that spirit, I wanted to share with you one study that was published earlier this year by Rethink X. And again, it's looking at transportation and the oil industry. I'm just going to show you one slide. This is a slide that has been absolutely shocking boardrooms in the automotive and oil industries. And what it shows, again, it's the same time scale, 2030, as the Sustainable Development Goals. And what it shows is a shift, a profound, a radical, a disruptive shift. And it's taking us into a world where we travel more, so there would be a 50% increase by 2030 in passenger miles traveled, but there would be a 70%, over a 70% collapse in the revenues produced in these industries. That's catastrophic for many of the companies that currently operate in those sectors. And we see some of the disruptors already in different ways being disrupted. So there is no straight line, even for exponential capitalists. A few words on breakthrough capitalism. About 5 years ago, in 2012, we organized an event, the Breakthrough Capitalism Forum. What we tried to do, and I know we've got some wonderful graphics being produced today, was get the sustainability industry thinking about some of these exponential trends. And in doing that, we started to film some of the people working with Atlas of the Future. We worked with Generation Investment Management and their foundation. And we looked at areas like the financial markets, working with UBS, and a new initiative, some of you may have heard of them, Arabesque, who are applying artificial intelligence to the tracking of now over 4,000 companies. So what I want to do now is just show you, we're very interested in the people who are trying to think exponentially. And I just wanted to show you a video, 1-minute video, that we put together with Atlas of the Future and the UN Global Compact. So could we see the video, please?
The trouble with pessimism and the trouble with despair that comes out of it is that as a response, not only is it useless, it's also no fun.
Failure is meant to be not the opposite of success, it's meant to define the true parameters of what real success could look like.
I feel very fortunate that I've got this front row seat to watch the next industrial revolution unfold in front of us. I'm not making this up.
How can we reimagine the way we deliver value or fulfill a fundamental human need?
There is a tsunami of change coming. The poorest child on the planet with a cell phone has access to as much information as the CEO of Google. Just complete evening of the playing field.
The infrastructure we build over the next 4 years will determine the fate of humanity.
You can throw your life into solving a problem through business.
And then you make big change.
And last night, a number of us had a wonderful dinner hosted by Ship2B. And I was told this morning that a number of the younger people said this morning, there's a guru who doesn't have the answers to everything. And the reason why I don't have the answers to everything is we are all in a process of disruption. I think the sustainability industry is going to be disrupted and needs disruption more than any other industry in this world of ours. And so what we're trying to do at Volans is stand back, reflect, talk to very different people, and get a sense of where this might go. And just an example of that, we've just put 2 new people on our board, and one of them is Paul Bungie, who's the chief scientist at the X Prize Foundation. So somebody who's really trying to stretch the realms of possibility, to go back to what I was saying earlier on about what's impossible and what's not. And as we've gone round Silicon Valley and places like that, talking to some of the people who are driving the new technologies, I keep asking them one question. Do they know Thomas Midgley Jr.? And nobody did. It's not a surprise. Thomas Midgley Jr. was somebody who worked for General Motors and DuPont in the 1920s and 1930s. He had an extraordinary career, brilliant engineer, brilliant scientist. He had over 100 patents to his name. And I just tell 3 very brief stories. The first one is he came up with a brilliant anti-knock technology, which was designed to make vehicles more fuel efficient. Brilliant. And it poisoned the nervous systems of hundreds of thousands of children around the world and really damaged their learning ability. The second breakthrough innovation he came up with, freons, part of the chlorofluorocarbon family. And they blew a hole in the stratospheric ozone layer. There was no way that Tom Midgley could have known that would have happened, but again, an example of what can go wrong. And then he contracted polio, which is a disease that we're still trying to get rid of, and he created himself a bed. This was in the early 1940s, and it worked with ropes and pulleys, and it was designed to get rid of the need for nursing. And it strangled him. And the reason I tell those stories is that however clever we are, however brilliant the technology we're working on, however successful the business models, there are going to be unexpected consequences. And with the Global Compact and with PA Consulting, we're looking at a range of different technologies that are now emerging. These are just some of them. And popping that up onto the Project Breakthrough website, just to remind people, to help people think a little bit more. The good news, the really good news, is that by 2030, the Business and Sustainable Development Commission are predicting in just 4 out of 60 market hotspots that there will be markets worth $12 trillion a year. And that's a figure that could well go higher. And we did a paper in support of that for the Commission, looking at business models, some of the new business models that are now starting to come through. Let me conclude. And let me just conclude talking about how, as a species and as economies, we're going to have to learn to use carbon much more effectively and productively. You saw Patrick Thomas, who's the CEO of a German company, Covestro, which used to be Biomaterial Science, who has backed this carbon productivity work. And the thesis is very simple. If you look around the world, economic productivity is increasingly under pressure. It's stalling. At the same time, you've got climate change, which is accelerating. Question, can you take both of those things and put them together and start to think about carbon productivity? And the question is, over time, can we all learn how to speak and think about carbon in very different ways? And this is some of the work that we've done with a McKinsey spin-out called Systemic, looking at the carbon cycle and different levers of change that business can use. So this is on a website called carbonproductivity.com. But I just wanted to move towards a conclusion by quoting something that a vice president in General Motors said to me 3 weeks ago. He said he expected in the automotive sector, and this is true in many other sectors, in the next 5 years to experience more change than in the last 50. And most people in the sustainability space or the social innovation space or impact investment do not yet quite think that way. So where are we headed next? This is the last slide just coming up. I mentioned Generation Investment Management. Their foundation has just put out an extraordinary white paper. I won't read, well, maybe I will read the text, but they're basically saying the sustainability revolution appears to have the scale of the industrial revolution and the agricultural revolution, and yet seems to be proceeding at the speed of the information revolution. And basically they're concluding that as it cranks through over the next 40 to 50 years, this will be the most significant economic event in our collective history. If you want any further background, I should get out of the way, those are some of the websites that you can go to. And then just very, very finally, if I sound pessimistic, I'm not. I think it's in exactly these periods of history where things start to melt down, that people who know what they're doing, very clear about that, and have the stamina and energy to push forward in the right way, drive change in a very, very different way. And I'm very much interested during the day to hear more about what you're all doing. Thank you very much indeed for your attention. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
A pleasure and a privilege to have you here with us today, John. It's been really fantastic. Yesterday we had dinner with John and the whole team of Ship2B, and it was really a pleasure for all our team. And we're going to go for the questions. We're going to pick all questions that you're making, and they're going to bring them to me. But meanwhile, I'm going to throw you the first question. And
right.
If it's
I'm
fine
ready.
with you.
It might be.
You, I mean, many people believe that you are the one that has created the brand of triple bottom line and sustainability. There are other gurus. I know you don't like the word gurus, that have created other labels. No?
Yeah.
Michael Porter has created the shared value. Bill Drayton has created the social entrepreneur. Peter Diamandis has created the exponential impact, and things like that. No, are these labels really worth it to do impact? And if so, what are the really good labels?
Well, just to start with an answer, I think these sorts of terms of practice or whatever are really important. I think people sometimes have said, words help us think. If we don't have the words for some of the things that we're trying to think, it's almost impossible to think about them. So I think language is immensely important. But what happens when you get these agendas going into the mainstream is that people very often, particularly academics, but all of us, become competitive. And we hold on to our piece of language and we promote it against everyone else's. I was saying last night, I've worked for 7 or 8 years now with a Nestle, with Michael Porter. And at some point in that process, the CEO basically put Michael Porter and I together to fight out the question of whether shared value, which I think is a brilliant concept, replaces, as Michael was arguing, sustainability. And you might not be surprised to know that my view was it doesn't. I think shared value is about win-win outcomes, which are fantastic. They're great to have. But we should be thinking about triple win, and we should be thinking about win, lose, lose. And if you think about the coal industry, for example, it's very hard to see how that industry is going to go into the future and win in a really major way. So I think shared value takes us part of the way, but it doesn't properly address sustainability. And at the end of that process, it took 18 months to get one word added. Nestle now talk about shared value and sustainability. So it's a tiny, tiny bit of progress. But I think it's important, because if people simply go down on one piece of language, it can blind them to a wider world.
Okay.
I'm not going to rise to your challenge of what are the really good pieces of language, but I do think that exponential language is quite useful and provocative. It doesn't mean that everybody's going to go exponential. Think about Travis Kalanick at Uber. More and more of these exponential business models. Think about Airbnb in Barcelona. They're going to hit social barriers, environmental barriers, and they're not yet properly prepared for that.
Very good. Here is the next one. What is the role of social innovation in the creation of this new order? Is really social innovation going to make it? We talked about this last night. Should we be all promoting social innovation to change the world?
Well, it's funny. We tend to think, when we think of innovation, of technology and of business models. And I think the real importance of social branding of innovation is because some of the most important innovations in our history have been more to do with the interactions between people than they have been about technology. And a couple of us were talking before the event started this morning about the innovation that saved most lives on our roads, that being the white line. I'd never really thought about that. But I mentioned the so-called plimsoll line on ships. It took 30 years to get that one simple idea put on ships so they couldn't be overloaded and in the process sink. I think social innovation is absolutely critical. And as we move towards 10 billion people, and increasingly, over 50% of us now live in cities, 70% of us in the future will live in cities, social innovation can only become more important. And one of the questions I'm often asked is, does it matter? Barcelona is starting behind some other parts of the world in areas like social innovation. Does that matter? I actually think it's a strength, because actually you can leapfrog some of the mistakes other people have made.
Very good. Last year we had as a keynote speaker Ferran Rodés. He told us that the corporates, in order to survive in the 21st century, they have to become more social and more connected to what the consumer needs. No? And here's a question on what do you think will the corporates look in the future if they really want to survive in this new terrain?
Well, I think every so often, a very large number of companies of all sizes die because they don't understand the emerging economic landscape. And I think over the next 15 to 20 years, many of the big brand companies that we think will be there forever will disappear, or will be acquired, or will be broken up, or bought by completely different people. If you think about the way Google or Amazon are starting to buy up really quite established players like Whole Foods and so on, I think that sort of process of transformation can only accelerate. Question about what they will look like, I don't yet know. I think they will be much better able to respect the opinions of people both inside and outside their organizations. I think they will recognize a vested interest in building very different forms of institutions. In many ways, I mentioned the United Nations, that's a post-World War II institutional innovation. Wonderful when it was created, really not fit for purpose in what comes next. And I think we've got to not destroy the institutional infrastructure that we've inherited, but this isn't just about companies. This is about the institutional landscape within which companies operate. I didn't think I was going to quote Mao Zedong this morning, but let me just do that. One of the things he said was, don't change the fish, change the sea. And I think if we take that message, then what we should be doing is trying to change the market dynamics, not just focusing on individual companies.
Very good. Here's the next one. This is a long one. As change happens, we all tend to be more short-term oriented.
Yeah.
But challenges need a long-term view that the West public policies, as opposed to China, do not have. how can we cope with challenges with our short-termism?
It's a very big problem. And I think if I'm right, and over the next 12 to 15 years, we see growing uncertainty, to some degree growing chaos, then exactly what you described will happen. It's already happening. People are thinking much longer term. One of the things we've been doing is starting to look out to sectors of the economy which by their very nature think long term. We've been talking to people like forestry companies. We've been talking to people in the educational area, people in the pensions fund world who are really having to think longer term. I mean, certainly multiple decades. But the other way of thinking about it is that many entrepreneurs and innovators are not thinking about the short term. They're not particularly thinking about the really deep long term either. When we set up sustainability, we were not thinking about a party in 2017 to celebrate 30 years. We're just scrambling to get this thing off the ground. And I think a lot of the thinking that will change the world in the right way, coming from people like the people in the audience today.
Very good. And here's the last one, John. Spain is behind all these concepts. It has really, I mean, when we hear people like you, sometimes it looks like science fiction. Is it really a problem? Will we ever get there on the sustainability agenda?
Can I duck that question in terms of Spain? In terms of the country as a whole, I don't know. But in terms of Barcelona and Catalonia, I think there is something about the spirit with which people come at enterprise and innovation in this region of Europe, which seems significantly different. And you know, I'm actually quite excited, I said earlier on, to be here for the first time in a very long time. And one of the things I've concluded last night is I want to come here more often because there is an excitement in Barcelona, there's an energy which is rare in Europe. You find it in places like Silicon Valley. So again, I said earlier on, I think anyone can leapfrog where the leaders now are, and I think you have very much the opportunity to do that. And I'm really looking forward to listening to people through the day to hear what you're all doing, what's working, what's not working. We really have to be quite open about some of that. But it's a thrill to be here. Xavier, thank you.
Thank you very much, John. Un aplauso para John. Ha sido un auténtico placer. And a pleasure. Thank you. Yes.